Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We have a lot to talk about in this first hour, and then I just might, as a program note, get you ready for next hour. We're going to be talking with Terry Ascott, and we're going to be talking about some of these incredible stories of faith from believers in the Middle East. Now, we've talked about that before in one way or another. Johnny Moore has been on this program with us, and of course, we've had a variety of other people. Tom Doyle fits into that category, and many, many more. Of course, we've had individuals talking about Voice of the Martyrs and Open Doors and the rest, but this is a very unique perspective because he is the founder of what today we call Sat7, which is a satellite television broadcast, and it has been an incredible way to reach out to those who are really, if you will, sequestered from the rest of the world. We used to talk about an iron curtain, and one of the great challenges for missions in the 20th century was communism. I'm not minimizing that because that still exists when we're talking about North Korea and Albania and China and all sorts of places like that. But perhaps the greater challenge in the 21st century has been the Muslim countries. Very difficult for individuals to go in at all, certainly not to go in as missionaries. And so how do you reach those individuals? Well, there have been a lot of publications and resources in that regard, and Terrence Ascott's been involved with that because they were publishing books and things like that. But again, the question was always in their minds, if you're trying to reach people in the Muslim world who are illiterate, they're not even going to be able to read the material you're making available to them, and television provided a real opportunity. They've been doing that for a quarter of a century, so we'll talk about how that developed. We'll also talk about how they are reaching the Muslim world for Christ, and maybe a little bit of lessons we can learn from them about how we reach our own Muslim friends, neighbors, and coworkers. So that's all coming next hour. This hour, want to start for just a few minutes, come back to the issue of the vaccine and media coverage of it, because this is one time when, you know, you're going to find we will agree with some of the things being said by President Joe Biden. This piece in which he is and his people have been talking about how the media has been, to use their words, completely irresponsible in terms of some of the coverage of the virus and been engaged in fear-mongering. So we're going to get into that. Also, an update on, are we going to eventually get a approval of at least the Pfizer vaccine? The answer seems to be that. And a piece by Rich Lowry on hypocrites who preach but don't practice. And we've seen that before with the vaccine and a few other things with the virus. But I'm going to move on later, maybe in the next segment, because we have some questions about this eviction moratorium. And we're going to talk about that for a little bit. We also have a number of pieces of legislation moving through Congress, which are certainly of concern, not the least of which is, if you look at the current, what's called infrastructure bill, 2,700 pages. Does anybody seriously think that any member of Congress is even going to give it a try to read that? And I am already starting to hear some really concerning things about that piece of legislation, which are significant enough to actually vote it down. But of course, if you do vote it down in the next election, you will be hearing all sorts of ads running against you, saying that you don't care about this country, you don't care about bridges and roads and all the rest. And of course, we know the way this game is displayed. There are more ornaments on this Christmas tree than at a Neiman Marcus Christmas tree during December. But nevertheless, we'll talk about some of that as well. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we will get into the whole issue of Islam and reaching out to the Muslim world. But the first article we have posted here is quite lengthy, so I'm going to give you just a brief summary of it, but I always encourage you to go and read them later, maybe even print them out and pass them around. But one of the things that I think is intriguing is during the time last year when there were so many negative reports about the virus, a lot of people alleged, especially Trump supporters, that this was done because the press was against Trump. Well, I agree with that, and maybe wanted to try to make the situation sound so difficult and blame Trump for everything and Mike Pence for everything so that it would ensure the election of a Democrat who ultimately came out to be Joe Biden after the primaries. But I've also said over time that when there isn't an election on the line, you see the press doing some things that don't make some sense. And I would have to agree that in this particular case, the criticism that has come from Joe Biden, and in particular, one of the people on his response team, it is Ben Wakana. He's actually the deputy director of strategic communications and engagement, but he's on kind of this COVID rapid response team. He has been very critical, for example, of the Washington Post and others, talking about, quote, a massive outbreak in Massachusetts among vaccinated individuals. And the story says that vaccinated individuals make up 3/4 of those infected in this massive Massachusetts outbreak. There was a tweet that New York Times put out, and a number of people, certainly Ben Shapiro and others, have pointed out because this tweet said, "Breaking news, the Delta variant is as contagious as chickenpox and may be spread by vaccinated people as easily as unvaccinated," which is actually not true. I mean, whether you are concerned about this or not, it is probably very true that the Delta variant is more contagious. It seems to be true, although this is more debatable, whether it is as deadly, but it is certainly not true, and you can find multiple examples of the fact that it isn't as easily transmitted among those who are vaccinated compared to those who are unvaccinated. And by the time you go to the fourth page of the article we've posted, this is where you have even our liberal friends who are critical of so many conservative outlets had to admit. This one is a Twitter post saying, "Look at this. Fox News is doing a better job of covering this story than the New York Times," because it shows where Fox News shows that it's a fraction of percent of individuals who are vaccinated who are actually dealing with some of the issues of transmission. So I think it is kind of an interesting illustration of the fact that sometimes, even if indeed the mainstream press is pretty much on the side of Joe Biden, they just can't help themselves for one very good reason, and it's the word ratings. That is, I'm going to get many more eyeballs and many more people watching the story. I'm going to get many more people reading a story in a newspaper. I'm going to get many more people clicking through. That's called clickbait, as you don't know. So that I will, in some respects, hype a story far beyond what is reasonable. And again, if you are living and dying by ratings, sometimes you don't get the more moderated kind of coverage of those stories. So I posted this article to help you understand that sometimes the media doesn't do this necessarily because they don't like Donald Trump, but because they are in the business of trying to make money. And so when you watch a program, when you go to a website, when you listen even to this radio program, use some discernment. That's what we're asking you to do, because you are going to have to be an informed consumer of media. When we come back, though, another issue that surfaces in this article and in some others: rules for thee, but not for me. We'll come back and talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
America is a divided country. Os Guinness, in his book Last Call for Liberty, argues that the American Republic is suffering its greatest crisis since the Civil War, and he believes the root of this disagreement is two different definitions of freedom. One view of freedom is embodied in 1776 in the American Revolution. The other view arose in 1789 in the French Revolution. The first can be found in the Declaration of Independence that owes its formulation to the Protestant Reformation, and even earlier in the book of Exodus. The second can be found in France's Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité that ended in the Reign of Terror, to which we can add Marx's triumph of the proletariat and in the policies of Stalin and Mao Zedong. His book asks 10 questions that make up the chapters of the book. When he was in the studio with me talking about his book, I mentioned that few Americans could answer the questions in the affirmative. He asked, "Do you know where your freedom comes from?" Even fewer could offer good answers to questions like, how do you plan to sustain freedom? He also addresses the question, how will you make the world safe for diversity? Here we have two starkly different visions of public life. On the one side are proponents of what Richard John Neuhaus called a naked public square that would exclude religion and religious expressions from public life. Proponents of a sacred public square would give preference to one religion. He advocates for a civil public square where citizens of all faiths are free to enter and engage public life on the basis of their faith. This book provides wise counsel on how Christians can be at the forefront of bringing America back to its proper understanding of freedom. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, I wanted to spend just a few more minutes talking about the virus and the vaccines, and then we're going to move on to some other topics. First of all, let me just mention that first article there talks about the fact that the White House is actually being critical of first social media, now mainstream media, in terms of their coverage of COVID-19 and talking about misinformation. And a good example of that is the misinformation that came from the Washington Post and the New York Times, and maybe a begrudging admission from at least some of our liberal friends, which is on about page 5 if you want to find it, that if we want to be honest, probably there is misinformation coming down from New York Times and the Washington Post, and the most accurate news channel right at the moment is Fox News, and they probably killed them to say that, and I'm sure they received all sorts of criticism for it, but I think it's true. Also, I did post a piece here in which you have a couple of individuals now that are coming out and saying, you know, really, the masks aren't all that effective, especially the cloth masks. Something we talked about a year ago. It's better than nothing. I mean, as I've said before, it's good, better, and best. You know, the best and 95. Better, you know, those which maybe have cloth but have a filter in there. And then, of course, you know, just the kind of weird things that I see some people wearing sometimes, which seemingly have no impact whatsoever. But it also brings us back to the fact that not only are there people, I believe, that are skeptical about how effective some of this masking is, the rule makers are as well. And so in this first article, there are some comments, but I wanted to go to a piece by Rich Lowry, which I thought did a better job of reminding us that we have, as he says, lots of COVID hypocrites preach but don't practice, or rule for thee, not for me. And he says, maybe a handy device for determining your status in American society is whether or not you feel that you should abide by the COVID rules. And he says the true masters of the universe, the people who imagine themselves to be great and good, actually preach this, but they don't actually follow the mandates they set forth. And he then begins to give us many examples. The one that starts everybody out, and the one that you see in almost all the articles about this, has to do with the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, who actually demonstrated very quickly that she says everybody is supposed to wear a mask, and was caught twice within about a 24-hour period not wearing a mask. One was where she was photographed sitting maskless as an indoor event, and officiated at a rooftop wedding ceremony. And that particular situation argued that, well, we are allowed to take our masks off while we're eating. There was no evidence, first of all, that she was eating. Second of all, nobody could see a mask sitting on the table anywhere at all. But nevertheless, that was the first one. And then there was another one, and I don't have that in front of me there. What was the other one? Oh, it was the birthday party. Of course, that was where she was there with some of these celebrities. And so you can quickly see that she says you all have to wear a mask, but on two separate occasions she was caught not wearing a mask and not even looking like she was trying to obey her own mandate. And, of course, then by the third page here, you have Rich Lowry reminding us she's not the only one. He, meaning Gavin Newsom, of course, was an individual that was seen at the French Laundry in Napa Valley, California. Goes through and talks about that. You know the story, especially people in California. You know the story better than we do. Or Nancy Pelosi violating the rules in San Francisco. Or for those of you in Illinois, of course, we can take the Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot getting her hair done. You go through a very long list of individuals who, as he describes it, are COVID hypocrites. They preach but don't practice. And the rules seem to apply to you, but not to them. And if there's any reason why I think we're going to have even more people violating some of these mask mandates, maybe even these vaccine mandates, is because of the fact that we would expect our leaders to model the behavior that we all should follow. And when we see those individuals in positions of leadership seemingly violate those rules, that's when we have real questions about how important they take the rules. And so if they don't seem to take them very important, guess what? The average person won't as well. So let's move on to the vaccines. This has been a question a lot of people have been asking. I was just thinking over the last couple of days, I get that question all the time. And I'm not in the public that much because I really always try to protect myself just in terms of health and everything else. But I was just thinking, even on Sunday, two different people brought up the issue of the fact that these vaccines do not have full approval. When I was in Birmingham, it came up. When I was in Tupelo, it came up. That just last week, just to mention a few examples. And yesterday, you heard me mention that maybe that is due mostly to the slowness of the bureaucracy. Apparently it is. The Food and Drug Administration announced, and this came out yesterday afternoon, that they are deciding to now accelerate its effort to review Pfizer's vaccine for full approval. Now, again, that is only Pfizer, but nevertheless, as you well know, Pfizer's mRNA, that would be messenger RNA vaccine, was approved last year under what's called emergency use authorization. And, of course, now we've had hundreds of millions of doses of just the Pfizer vaccine alone. Add to that Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, and you've had very few negative effects. So you would think that this would be pretty much a foregone conclusion. But it has still not been fully approved. And as I pointed out yesterday, at least one survey talks about some of those people that are, quote, on the fence about the vaccine. A good percentage of them said part of the concern was there wasn't full approval. Now, I suspect for a number of people, that's just an excuse. It's not a reason. They're just going to come up with some other excuse when it gets approval. But for the people that I've had a chance to talk to, I think that is at least a lingering doubt. And so President Biden has actually said now that he believes that there will be full FDA approval he says as early as September. I have my doubts, but maybe October is another possibility. And that's if the emergency label, as they're saying, is holding back vaccinations, well, then why not make this a health priority very quickly? Because it's not like we don't have lots of experience with this now nationwide. So those are just a couple of the topics that I wanted to address that relate to the vaccine. But one of the other big issues because of COVID has been this moratorium on evictions. And this is a good example, again, of where this should not have caught anyone off guard. As you may know, it was believed that because of the fact that we have had a number of people that have lost their jobs, they were laid off or whatever, there was a decision which was pushed forward by the Centers for Disease Control to actually have a moratorium on evictions if people did not pay their rent. What sounds like a very compassionate idea, first of all, has been, very harmful for the people that own those rental properties. I mean, there may be a tendency sometimes to think, well, this is just, rich corporations, so they can actually be able to stem the tide, and they can probably cover that with their cash flow. Well, again, you look at many of these rental properties, which are owned by, say, middle-class people who own their house and then maybe bought a rental property to support their income, to supplement their income. Or maybe they've had a piece of property that they decided to turn into a rental property and then moved into maybe an apartment because they could get quite a bit and thus be able to be self-sufficient. So we're talking about people that could really be harmed by all of this. And you might say, well, yeah, but aren't we supposed to have provided money for rent relief? Yes, and I've looked it up, all of 7% of that money that was allocated has actually been dispersed. So you've had a situation where some of these landlords find themselves not being able to even pay their own expenses because the people in their rental property are prevented from and actually relieved from paying any kind of rent. Well, the moratorium was to expire, and it did. I want to come back and talk about some of the technical details about this. And we can, of course, raise the question of whether it was a good idea. I have my doubts. But there is also, I think, a teaching opportunity here to say, what does the Constitution allow and what does the Constitution prohibit? And then when you get to this, there's also a Supreme Court ruling where Justice Brett Kavanaugh said, since the moratorium is going to expire, well, we won't do anything because it's just going to take care of itself. Of course, now they want to extend the moratorium on paying rent. And so hopefully Justice Kavanaugh learned a lesson. I doubt it, but maybe he did, and recognized that by not ruling on the case and simply kicking the can down the road just now has created the crisis that we're talking about here on Capitol Hill. So when we come back, we're going to talk about that in a little bit and find ourselves agreeing not only with Andrew McCarthy and what he has to say, but this will surprise you, even agreeing with some of the things that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said. So we've got a lot to cover, and we will do that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I want to talk about evictions for just a minute and the eviction moratorium. And this has been something that was implemented primarily through the executive orders and through the recommendation of the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. Okay, we can, first of all, set aside, I think, a very legitimate concern as to whether or not having a moratorium on evictions is a good idea. idea. I think that it's a bad idea for a number of reasons. If you do want to help people that are unable to pay their rent, well, then let's provide benefits to them at the state level, federal level, whatever. But when you have a moratorium on evictions, just think of the mindset that develops very quickly. It doesn't matter what I do in this apartment or this rental property because they're not going to evict me. That's not a good thing, right? Also, of course, it is harmful for the individuals that are the landlords. Now, you may have had a really awful landlord you don't like, and you say, good, I'd like to stick it to them. But, most landlords are pretty good, and they don't deserve to be treated like that simply because we now tell them, those individuals, the renters, that they will not be evicted. As a matter of fact, as you've done interviews, a lot of them think, I never have to pay my rent again. And so you've created a mindset that is really harmful. But I will set that aside. We can have our debate as to whether or not an eviction moratorium makes any sense. I really want to focus on the whole constitutionality of it in the first place, because every court that has had a chance to look at this, just about, has actually argued that this is not constitutional. First of all, let's just start with Constitution 101. The various rents that people are paying are actually paid within a state, right? So that would be what you would call an intrastate commerce. And so that's not governed by the Congress. Even if Congress were to pass this legislation, they can't right now for all sorts of reasons I'll get to in just a minute. It wouldn't be constitutional either because, after all, Congress is allowed through the Commerce Clause to deal with intrastate, that is between states, but people paying rent, they're paying rent within Mississippi, and they're paying rent within Oregon, they're paying rent within California, they're paying rent within Georgia. There's no intrastate situation, so that's reason enough to maybe set it aside. But the lower courts also made some other comments, and that is, even if you acknowledge that, judges said, well, first of all, Congress did not authorize this, so this was done just by an edict from the executive branch. There was no inherent executive authority to order it, and it is not authorized by statutory law that the Centers for Disease Control could ever manipulate that. So this is why the lower courts were wanting to get rid of it. But even though you had 4 conservative justices who were ready to vacate what's called the stay and thus scrap the moratorium, you had Justice John Roberts and in particular Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And Kavanaugh himself said, look, even though this probably is lawless, since the moratorium was going to lapse in a few weeks anyway, I'm not going to actually rule in that regard. Quite frankly, if he had agreed with the other 4 conservative justices, we would already be dealing with this back then and not now. If nothing else, as Andrew McCarthy says in our 3rd article, you would hope that maybe Justice Kavanaugh learned a lesson, because now, just as soon as the moratorium expired late Sunday night, early Monday morning, however you want to say it, now you've had individuals wanting to do something. You've had Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and all sorts of other individuals protesting. And to her credit, she went on to various talk shows and acknowledged that this is not a problem that was created by the Trump administration. This is not a problem created because we have some Republicans in the House and the Senate. This was a problem created by the Democrats. So I got to give her credit for that, at least willing to put blame where it was. And in particular pointed out that the Biden administration, which knew this was happening, didn't do anything until the last hour, and then just lamely called for Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer to push for a legislative fix. But of course, they couldn't push for a legislative fix because guess what? They didn't have the votes for it. Now, I bring you back to the key issue. And again, let's give Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez some credit. Not going to hear it every day on this program. She pointed out the fact that we do have money to actually provide to landlords rent relief. There is $3 billion that was allocated in the previous piece of legislation. Everybody remember that? $3 billion with a B that has been given out. but they actually allocated $47 billion. So, again, doing my math real quickly here, that's 7%. So yes, $3 billion went out, and so some landlords were able to benefit with that, and that was allowing them, while this moratorium was taking place, for them to be able to pay their taxes, and oftentimes they are the ones that have to pay for the light, the utilities, the water, and all those kinds of things. Sometimes not, depends on which situation you have, and yet that's $3 billion out of $47 billion. So in other words, there's still $42 billion just sitting out there. Now, whose fault is that? Well, again, you can try to blame Donald Trump on that. You can try to blame the Republicans on that. You can even try to blame Congress on that. But really, it gets down to the Biden administration. And so, as Andrew McCarthy says, and we'll end it with this, the Biden administration and congressional Democrats have known for months that the moratorium was illegal, yet they pressed ahead figuring that they could demagogue as heartless anyone who dared to call for its elimination. There was no reason to believe that they were going to use the time Brett Kavanaugh naively gave them to address the problem, since they've always been heedless of the damage the moratorium was doing to average people. And so, as a result, they simply let that expire and then had a little protest late Sunday night calling attention to it. But just before we end this segment, let me also say that Andrew McCarthy is not critical of the Democrats, although they certainly sure deserve some of that if indeed they were so concerned about this moratorium. He's more critical of Brett Kavanaugh. And it gets back to this. He uses a football analogy. He said, if Bill Belichick famously tells his players, just do your job. What that means is a lineman doesn't have to do the other players' jobs. He just needs to block and let the quarterback worry about hitting the open receiver. Is that a more hopeful proposition when the quarterback is Tom Brady? Sure. And it's fair enough to observe that Nancy Pelosi is no Tom Brady. Okay, obviously. Still, it's simply not the Supreme Court's job to superintend the administrative state. Just what the law is and what the law should be, and leave it to Congress and the administration to short out the hash that they've made of it. And I think there's a lesson to be learned there, that here is a good example, once again, in this case. You know, we do like some of the things that Brett Kavanaugh's done, but this is a good example of one that I think was a terrible error. He says, well, it's going to expire anyway, so we won't rule on it. And by not ruling on it, you've got the problem that we've got right now. If they'd ruled on it then, of course, it would have made the Supreme Court, quote, the bad guy, but it would have been upholding the rule of law. But instead, we simply allowed this charade to continue on. And again, if you say, well, what about these poor people that might be evicted? Well, how about that $42 billion that has not been dispersed to the landlords who could then provide that as rent relief? So who's to blame? I'm going to give at least some blame to the Supreme Court, and in particular to Brett Kavanaugh and the rest of the Democrats that are in power right now and allowed this to actually take place. Just before I take a break, I will just mention, and we won't get into this much this time, but maybe in the next few days, we do have an infrastructure bill being considered. That infrastructure bill, I told you just a few minutes ago, has 2,700 pages. 2,700 pages. And you might say, well, then that should be a reason that I would think many of the Republican senators would vote against it. Oh, no, there's some things to buy them off. One of those is what is called the Buy America provision, which says that you're supposed to buy American goods. But there are all sorts of exceptions. If there are insufficient materials, if the American-made products aren't satisfactory according to your judgment, or if buying America actually increases the cost. So even though this is an attempt to win over a few more Republican votes, if you look at the details of the 2,700 pages, you'll recognize it really doesn't do what it says it will do, and it's just an excuse to spend another $1 trillion plus. We'll see what the final amount is, but more than $1 trillion on infrastructure, when only a percentage of that goes to anything you and I would call infrastructure, which would be roads and bridges and ports. Anyway, let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We have a few more minutes. We're going to be talking in the next hour with Terry Ascott, Stories of Faith from the Middle East, Dare to Believe. And he's in Cyprus, but I'm pretty sure we'll be able to make a connection there. It is interesting. Sometimes when we do these phone calls overseas, we actually have a clearer connection than we sometimes have here in the United States. So we'll see how that works out. And he will be with us. And I think it'll be a real encouragement to you to see what is happening in the Middle East and the dynamic witness that they've had for some time. But just before we wind down, let me, if I can, go to our last article I've posted today by Victor Davis Hanson. And I find myself coming to him so often because he's a student of history and he applies some of those lessons of history to our contemporary environment. And this one has the arresting title, Incompetence plus Arrogance equals Woke. Now, he raises the question, is it that because some of these companies and various athletes and other people are woke and in some respects social justice warriors, that they aren't necessarily doing a very good job? Or is it because they're not doing a very good job, they're using this to mask their incompetence? And so that is a striking point. There's 6 pages here, and we only have a few minutes, so I'm going to break it down to 1 to 6. If you've got something to write with, you can write them down, because he first of all reminds us of the fact that we've had mass hysterias in history. We've had times in which almost insanity breaks out. The Salem witch trials, some of the things that happened during the French Revolution, revolution, McCarthyism, and on and on and on, where you've had some of these taking place. And then you had all sorts of fads. And he talks about the tulip bubble, the hula hoop, the pet rock fads. He does go through all of that. But he says, maybe what we're dealing with here is what he calls the Bloomberg effect. That is, the governor of New York actually used that to maybe focus on some of the issues like virtue signaling so that it would take people's attention away from the fact that it was difficult for New York City to clear the snow on time. And so instead blame that on global warming, talk about the dangers of supersized soft drinks and on and on and on, so that you can take attention off from the fact that you're just not really doing a very good job. So here's 1 to 6. Number 1, Delta Airlines. The CEO there earns $17 million in annual compensation, but chose a while back, as we've talked about, and our listeners in Georgia are well aware, to lecture everybody about the so-called racist voting laws in the state of Georgia that were implemented because it required a valid ID. Of course, he points out that in order to get on one of these Delta Airlines, you have to show a valid ID. But he then goes on, that is Victor Davis Hanson, to say, I encourage the public to call Delta's consumer helplines and see how well they are treated in terms of what's called customer service, in terms of credits, refunds, rebooking, recalibrating. And he talks about the fact that if he cannot ensure adequate customer service, maybe he shouldn't be weighing in on these voter laws. Number 2, he takes on American Airlines, and people in the state of Texas might know that as well. CEO Doug Parker, he's woke too. Of course, they're also talking about the possibility, hadn't happened yet, in Texas passing some revisions in the voter laws, and in particular looking at tougher voter ID usage. And yet he says, again, you might want to ensure that your airliner does not become a third world carrier, and then begins to tell some stories of American Airlines flights that he has taken that messed up in pretty significant ways, and could not find a plane to get him back to where he wanted to be. And you can just begin to see all the concerns he could raise with the airlines. But I'm going to move on, because then he takes on the professional athletes, including the Olympic athletes, who lecture the country, he says, on various sins of racism, sexism, the isms and ologies and that kind of thing. And he says, is there a connection between their wokeness and the general lack of interest in the NBA, Major League Baseball, NFL, and the Tokyo Olympics? And maybe the whole idea that maybe some Americans are starting to get just a little bit fed up with what look like privileged and spoiled 20-somethings and 30-somethings. And so that's another one that he brings to the table. Number 4, of course, he talks about Hollywood. He says, almost every day you have a megastar joining the outraged Twitter chorus and talking about social injustice when many of them are doing quite well, multimillionaires and the rest. And he says the real travesty, though, isn't social justice, but the fact that Hollywood simply makes poor movies, he says, or rather remakes them ad nauseum, ensuring only they are diverse and proportional. He talks about the only genres that are seemingly doing very well are computer-enhanced comic book films, or then the hero versus the man movies, and then goes into some other aspects of that as well. Number 5, he lists, of course, the universities. That's an easy shot for him as an individual that has been a professor in the past, but again reminds us that we supposedly have these elite universities, and yet when we start looking at the educational performance, he asks, I think, a very legitimate question. Is the general knowledge of the college student today superior to his counterpart of, say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when you see so many of these courses that used to be mandatory courses now optional or not even offered at all? And then number 6, you might have guessed this one, the military, because the military has always been a good example of an institution that was really kind of in the center of the country, but now its woke credentials are starting to be flaunted more and more. And of course, he talks about the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley and others, and some of the statements there, and the Admiral and a variety of others. He gives you a long list of the examples and asking the fundamental question, with all this focus on trying to deal with domestic terrorism, if indeed that's much of an issue, and to deal with social justice, is that helping us provide a deterrent to the Chinese military? And I think you can see his answer to that one is no. So he kind of ends at the very end by simply saying this: the point is not to berate our institutions, but to warn them. Again, he's not trying to be critical of them, but he's saying, I really want to warn you, because we can learn some lessons from history. Either their abilities to carry out their assigned task are becoming diminished by 1984 like wokeism, or they are using ideological camouflage to simply mask their unaccountability and their increasing incompetence. And it's a fascinating piece. I have summarized 6 full pages in just a few minutes, and I would encourage you to read it because it helps us understand our cultural moment when, again, you have his expertise as a person that is obviously a scholar in the classics and in history to say, we may have seen this before. And you think about magicians, they are very effective in misdirection, getting you to look at one thing and not to look at the sleight of hand. And I'm beginning to think that his argument that maybe some of this is a Bloomberg effect is exactly an explanation for some of the reasons why so many have gone woke. Now, I do believe some of them literally believe it, but also if I can focus on these small things and get your attention there, you'll ignore my incompetence and my lack of customer service in somewhere else. It's worth thinking about, and as always, I find myself appreciating the good work of Victor Davis Hanson. If you'd like to know a little bit more, we've posted all of those articles on our website, including the book we're going to talk about next hour. My Viewpoints commentary today is based on the book by Os Guinness, Last Call for Liberty. We are certainly seeing a challenge to our freedom and our liberty, and that's one of the things we talk about here on Point of View. So as you go there, you might find some of these articles, and if you want to hit that donate button and help us out during the month of August, we would greatly appreciate it. Let's take a break, and we're going to come back and talk about faith in the Middle East. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information. about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to be talking about the subject of faith in the Middle East, and I think you're really going to be encouraged in this regard. Of course, we've talked about this before with Johnny Moore and Tom Doyle and so many others, but we're first of all going to talk a little bit about the opportunity to use media in a very effective way to reach out to the Muslim world. You know, the closed countries in the 20th century used to oftentimes be the communist countries, and there's still some of those today, but more and more the closed countries tend to be the Muslim countries. It is difficult to get a missionary in there, even difficult to get in there a person that doesn't claim to be a missionary but is doing covert mission work. But there is an opportunity through the media that has existed but is now accentuated in ways that I think you're really going to be encouraged about. And so we're going to spend some time using this new book that has come out, Dare to Believe, Stories of Faith from the Middle East. It is written by Terry Ascott. He is a British citizen who lived in the Middle East and has lived in the Middle East for 50 years, currently lives in Cyprus, and served as a founder of this organization that we'll be talking about, Sat7, which was the first Christian satellite television service. But before that, had been with Operation Mobilization, had been with the idea of even trying to provide various pieces of literature for those. And it's a really encouraging and exciting story. Those of us that are part of the National Religious Broadcasters have seen him not only be awarded, which I think is so encouraging, but also to have him speak. And that is why when you open up his book, you see endorsements that come from people like Wayne Peterson and Johnny Erickson Tata and Ron Harris and Tom Doyle and a number of people that have been on the program in the past. So, Terry, I know you're there in Cyprus. I'm hoping this will be a good and easy long-distance connection. How are we doing today?
I hope we're doing fine. Yes, thanks. Good afternoon to you.
Yeah, I think it's evening for you, but afternoon for us. Let's, if we can, maybe tell the whole story, because the book I thought was going to be some of the testimonies of faith, which it is. But early on, I learned a little bit more about you in terms of Operation Mobilization. And so can we tell your story for a little bit? Because I don't want to jump in just with Sat7, because there are just so many other things that are part of your story in this book.
Okay, yes. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I actually heard the gospel for the very first time when I was in my mid-teens and became a believer. And very early on, I met some of the Operation Mobilization OM people that are setting up their headquarters for the UK very near where I live. So I got involved, read the literature, spent some summers in France and other places, and became very convinced about the power of Christian literature, and actually began to publish materials for students across the UK by the million, literally. It was during those years of uprisings at the end of the 60s when student rebellions were taking place in Europe. But eventually, after I finished my studies in civil engineering and worked a year or so, I committed to go for 1 year with OM. And I thought I was going to India, because that's where I sort of developed a certain passion. But then they asked me to go to Lebanon. Well, I didn't even know where Lebanon was. I had to get out an atlas to see where it was.
Yes.
And it was a one-year commitment. I went there, it was in the early 70s, before the Civil War had started. Fell in love with the place, really. The opportunities and the needs were so enormous that at the end of that first year, my wife and I, and we'd only been married 2 weeks before we went, decided to stay another year, and then it was another year, and then we ended up in Egypt, and that was 14 years, and then I got deported from Egypt over human rights issues and ended up in Cyprus. So that's it in a can, but essentially I'm a great believer in literature and the power of the printed word or the spoken word, radio. I have my reservations about television, and that was quite something I had to wrestle with before we began Sat7.
Just before we get into that, let's go talk about that, because, you are in Beirut, Lebanon. Then you have the Civil War, which then caused you to go to Egypt. But one of the things I love about your story is no matter where you are, you say, well, I'll just take what I've got, and I use the circumstances I find myself in. So if I remember right, you had like a Arabic youth magazine and a number of things in Egypt before you were later deported. So all the time, wherever you were using the existing forms of media to communicate. But again, you were pretty much dedicated to print. And then we'll get into how you ended up in television in just a minute. But those distributions really were very significant to begin to challenge the Muslim world with the Christian faith, weren't they?
Yes. I mean, there's different ways you can approach the Muslim world, of course. For me, it's a question of making the gospel accessible to people. We're not forcing it on anybody. We're not converting anybody. That's the work of the Holy Spirit. Our job is to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to hear the gospel at least once in their lifetime and make an informed decision. In fact, I'd go as far as to say it's actually a human right that people should have that opportunity. And so my work has always been about reaching the most number of people I can with the maximum amount of the gospel that the media permits me to share with them.
Let's talk a little bit about how you then came to this idea of visual media. I think, didn't you attend the Lausanne Movement's Leaders Conference and a few other things, and began to think, of course, as you talk about here in the book, that if you are printing literature, that's great for people that are literate, but if you're trying to reach those who are illiterate or do not speak the language, television provides a different opportunity, doesn't it?
It does. I think the turning point for me was in the early 80s. I was walking home from my publishing office in Cairo, and I was walking down the street to my home that's on the 6th floor of an apartment block. And right next to the apartment block, they were beginning the construction of a new building, and they bought sand and cement and a watchman to take care of it. The watchman lived literally on the road with a strip of tarpaulin to keep off the sun, and he had 3 kids and a wife, and they had a few cooking utensils. But tonight, when I was coming home, they had a TV set in the road, and it was wired across the building site to a sympathetic neighbor's PowerPoint. And I just stood there and looked and thought, it doesn't matter what I publish, magazines, books, tracts. This person will never hear the gospel through reading, but this person has got a TV set, because once you've got it, it's an endless source of free information, free entertainment, keeps the kids out of trouble. It's just a must-have appliance. It gives you escapism from all the grinding poverty in which you live. You can live vicariously through television. And so I began to think about, using television. But television is a difficult medium. You have to go on TV. You have to wear makeup. You sit in front of an artificial set.
Oh, things I'm glad I don't have to do on radio. Let's take a break because I want to come back. But if you get the book, there's a wonderful picture of this family watching television in Egypt, just out there in the streets, and it makes the point. But we'll come back and continue our conversation with Terry right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
America is a divided country. Os Guinness, in his book Last Call for Liberty, argues that the American Republic is suffering its greatest crisis since the Civil War, and he believes the root of this disagreement is two different definitions of freedom. One view of freedom is embodied in 1776 in the American Revolution. The other view arose in 1789 in the French Revolution. The first can be found in the Declaration of Independence that owes its formulation to the Protestant Reformation, and even earlier in the book of Exodus. The second can be found in France's Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité that ended in the Reign of Terror, to which we can add Marx's Triumph of the Proletariat and in the policies of Stalin and Mao Zedong. His book asks 10 questions that make up the chapters of the book. When he was in the studio with me talking about his book, I mentioned that few Americans could answer the questions in the affirmative. He asked, "Do you know where your freedom comes from?" Even fewer could offer good answers to questions like, how do you plan to sustain freedom? He also addresses the question, how will you make the world safe for diversity? Here we have two starkly different visions of public life. On the one side are proponents of what Richard John Neuhaus called a naked public square that would exclude religion and religious expressions from public life. Proponents of a sacred public square would give preference to one religion. He advocates for a civil public square where citizens of all faiths are free to enter and engage public life on the basis of their faith. This book provides wise counsel on how Christians can be at the forefront of bringing America back to its proper understanding of freedom. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue conversation today with Terry Ascott as we talk about his book, Dare to Believe, and also give you a little better understanding of the stories that are coming out about faith in the Middle East, as well as the impact of media. And Terry, you were talking about television. Again, for our listeners, here maybe gives you an understanding as to why you're thinking, is this a really good idea? I mean, after all, you have a degree in civil engineering. Now we're talking about doing television. You are talking about all the things that have to happen to make a television program work, and that's makeup and lighting and all sorts of stuff. And it's got to be visually interesting. But to illustrate your point, and your book is full of great illustrations, I do really encourage people that if they wanted to learn a little bit more about missions, and maybe they even want to encourage people in a missions conference, the chapters and the pictures of you and your family and others are great. But there's one picture of a family watching television in rural Egypt, 1982. I've got 3 kids on the floor. Just on the dirt, basically. You can see the brick around there. You've got a father with another child on his lap, and they're watching a small television set, and next to them is a camel sitting there like a dog would be sitting there in someone's living room. So this is out there on the streets. This is, there's some hay, there's a camel, there's just one rickety chair, there's people, but they're all watching television, and you began to see, if you really want to communicate the gospel, especially to those who either are illiterate or maybe they know Farsi and Arabic and all of that in just a minute, you began to see how television might indeed be the answer.
That's right. And I think it was in 1986 when the first Arabsat satellite was launched that we began to see the potential for using satellites to go, with uncensored content directly to homes across the whole region. Now, that didn't happen in the 80s, but it did happen in 1991. The first Arabic language satellite television began. It was a Saudi channel, and they couldn't do it from Saudi Arabia for legal reasons. They had to do it from London. But that really, for me, opened the door to my thinking that now, for the first time, I live with censorship. All our books and magazines had to be censored before distribution. National television stations would censor our material if we gave them a Christian program. But now we could go directly without censorship into people's homes. And so we were able to actually start in 1996 with 2 hours a week of broadcasting. That's all we could do. So we didn't have any product. We didn't have any staff. We didn't even have a camera. We had to rent equipment and facilities to make the first programs. But it was really amazing to see. And every year since the 1990s, the number of people with a satellite dish at home, in other words, access to uncensored Christian television, has grown. And even though the internet is very important and we're using that more and more, especially for online portals that can stream our material and video on demand, but still the only uncensorable media in the Middle East today is satellite television.
And again, we'll get into that in just a minute. It'd be worthwhile, just I was telling some people off air, how you came up with the name Sat7. And some of that has to do with the fact that there were some other satellite channels, and you were trying to figure out, what are we going to call this thing?
Right, we needed something that would work in multiple languages. It had to be short so you could put it on the screen. It had to have some kind of Christian symbolism, but we didn't want it so Christian that it turned off non-Christian people, Muslims, before they even heard the content. So Sat7, there was already a Sat1, Sat2, Sat3 German satellite channels.
Right.
So we came up with 7 because 7 is, in Scripture, a very holy number, a complete number. And, of course, there's endless examples of that. Forgive your brother 70 times 7. God created the world in 7 days. On the seventh day rested. And so on and so on.
Well, again, that's in Chapter 3. Let's talk about that, how to start a TV station, because, like you said, at first you didn't have on-air talent, you didn't have cameras and all the rest, and we're going to build you from one station to a network and eventually 24/7, but you got started, like you said, 2 hours a week. But take us to the next step of faith that you had to take.
Well, I think it was... the next step. Well, really, it was just God bringing people to us, and most of our staff learnt on the job as they went forwards. They didn't know anything about television, but they had a passion to do something. We had people who came as editors, had never edited, but they became amazingly creative people. We had people who'd never been in front of a TV camera who were able to really share their faith in a passionate and very winsome way to audiences. We had people who never actually spoken to people on the phone about their faith, who were running the telephone counseling centers that were springing up in different countries. So it was really just a growth experience. And we had to invent everything. We didn't want television modeled on the Western model. We didn't want to sell our airtime, for example. There's a lot of very good Christian television in the West, but it's not appropriate, and we don't want to give the impression to Muslims that Christianity is some kind of Western import. No, we wanted to provide a platform for Middle East Christians to share their faith in their language and dialects in a much more authentic way than any Western programming would do. But that means you pay for your airtime and you pay for making programs, you buy good cartoons for kids, you buy a few Christian films from the West and dub them, but all the teaching programs, the worship programs, the apologetic programs, these are all made by Middle East Christians in the Middle East. It's very exciting.
One of the things that I think is very unique, and well, not totally unique, but certainly a significant issue, is what you call seminary on the air. In other words, we can be honest, sometimes Christian television isn't necessarily very deep in terms of some of its theology, and yet you wanted to be more deliberate and systematic in terms of your teaching. But then that raises a good question on the part of some. Well, then, is this going to replace Bible schools? But early on, you also wanted to make sure that you had very good, solid Bible teaching, and to teach it in a way that really was kind of a television seminary class, wasn't it?
That's right. Well, what we discovered very quickly was that we found all these new believers springing up everywhere. These are people who were forming house groups, and the leader happened to be the first person in the group that had listened to Sat 7 and become a Christian. But they had no theological training.
Right.
They would never get it. They would never be able to go to a seminary because they only existed in a few countries like Lebanon and Egypt and Jordan, and you couldn't get a visa, especially if you were from a Muslim background, to go and study theology, Christian theology in these places, if you could afford it. And so what we thought, I think that came home to me when I went to Morocco once, and I was talking to a group, and they say, "Oh, we love your broadcasts every week, and the hymns that you put." And I began to realize that the only hymns they knew were the ones we broadcast. The only teaching they got was the teaching we gave them. But we had not been deliberate in our hymnology. We'd not been deliberate in our theology. We were not seeking to be, completely holistic in our approach to biblical teaching. So that's when we got involved with the evangelical seminaries in Jordan and Lebanon and Egypt, and began to put together a curriculum and then try to translate that into an audio-visual form by breaking it down into instructional design modules with the theologians. It was quite a challenge to get television people and theologians to actually work together. It was extremely challenging, actually, and it failed the first year or two. We had to start all over again with a new group, but it's been very good to have that.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about the expansion that went from Arabic Christian programming to Persia and Farsi, and then Turkey and a few other things, and then also some of the stories of faith from the Middle East. Some very sad stories, but hopefully might be encouraging to you as well. And this is one of the, if you will, prayer targets for you, because we want you to be praying about those individuals who are believers in the Middle East that are facing persecution. We also want you to know more about Sat 7, so you can go to Sat 7, it's SAT, and then the number 7.org. We have that link there, so you can find out more about the book, about the mission. You can donate to that as well. You can get their prayer requests, and you can watch some of the material that is there, and it is all available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll talk about the expansion into Iran, into Turkey, and other places right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, Terry Ascott with us. And again, we're talking about his book, Dare to Believe. But if you'd like to know a little bit more about this broadcast that is really supporting Christians in the Middle East and North Africa, we have a link to that on our website, pointofview.net. It's sat7.org. The 7 is the number 7. And they are involved in spreading the good news to those individuals through a number of different channels. And up until now, Terry, we've been talking about, of course, the Arabic channel, but then you also have a kids channel. But I thought we might, for just a few minutes, talk about two others. And the first was to actually have another 24-hour channel in Farsi to Persians. That would be Iran. And as I understand it, you always had a desire to actually try to take these biblical ideas and Christian perspective to Iran. And that has been kind of the focus of a lot of our attention around here because of everything from the Iranian Revolution to the possibility of this becoming a nuclear-armed Middle Eastern country to the battle between Iraq and Iran and all of those things. And, of course, in the midst of that, there are a number of Christians in Iran, maybe quite a number, and by having a television channel to them, you are able to bypass some of the censorship that would have actually taken place through the Iranian Republic, don't you?
Yeah. Iran was always a part of the original vision of Sat7, as was Turkey. And I suppose it really helped when I had an assistant whose father was an Iranian. He was an American. He'd been brought up in a Muslim Christian home. His mother was Christian, and he'd become a believer. But he brought this kind of encouragement into the team that we need to do something about Iran. Well, we did put together a team of people living outside the country and also people living in Iran at that time. And we began to work on how we were going to make programs and get them on air. And I made a trip to Iran in 2002. Mm-hmm. It was really a real eye-opener, amazing place. And the people, so open, so pro-American, actually.
Yes, so I've heard.
The stories in the book there, it is amazing. You meet people and they say, excuse me, do you have a Bible I could get? Mm-hmm. They are so disillusioned with the revolution of 1979 and the way that they've been oppressed in the name of their religion. That people have turned away. They've become atheists. They've become Zoroastrians, an old, Persian religion. But many have found Christ just because Christ offers them hope. It offers them a way of breaking the cycle, end the cycle of an eye for an eye, this senseless killing that goes on in the Middle East today. He talks about forgiveness, reconciliation, salvation, giving hope to people. And so the response from Iran has been unlike anything else we've had from the Arab world or from Turkey. And it's just been so fantastic, the responses, the stories. And obviously God is working in people's lives through visions and dreams too, yes. Because we often hear about these as part of their testimony to us. After they've watched a program, they'll say how God spoke to them through a vision or a dream, mm-hmm. or led them to watch the channel at a critical time in their life, and so on.
Let's see, we can talk about a couple of stories because, for example, we'll focus on Iran for just a minute. You have Sohar, who had a husband, Kurush, who actually beat her, but she began watching, and that affected her. Kurush, the husband who was the wife beater, also began to watch, was struck by his own sin, embraced Christ. She reported that the beating stopped. You tell a story of Hamad, who was calling the channel for counseling, because he was a gangster, a thief, a drug dealer. You just got some incredible stories of individuals who actually have watched that television program and have seen their lives change because of the power of the gospel.
Amen. Yes. And I think what's even more amazing are some of the stories of the believers and the way they stood firm in the face of persecution and difficulties. They're such an inspiration to us in the West as we read their stories of martyrdom, of great sacrifice for the kingdom of God.
One other one I thought we would mention, since we were talking about Iran, is then also taking this into Turkey. You mentioned that just a minute ago, but many people think, well, that's just like what you have in the Arab world. But Turkey is a very different country in a number of ways, and that's why you felt that you really needed a separate channel for it. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Well, first of all, the obvious issue of language. They don't understand Arabic any more than Persian. So it is a completely different audience. There's probably 100 million people who speak Turkish or a Turkic language in nearby countries. And Patrick Johnson of Operation World described Turkey as perhaps the most unevangelized country in the world today.
Wow.
And it's true. There's such a nationalistic streak in Turkey. To be a Turk is to be a Muslim. And any Christians, Armenians or others, Greeks, these are the enemy. These are people that have always been, through the Ottoman era and so on, the enemy. And so you've got to overcome all this negativity towards Christ and Christianity, the church, before you can even begin to explain the gospel. And yet Turkey was the home of the seven churches. It's where people were first called Christians and so on and so on. So it's got a rich Christian history. So again, we began working with local Christians in Istanbul and other areas, developing just a few hours a week that we put onto the Arabic channel initially. And then eventually, with the help of some really talented believers in Turkey, we were able to move to a 24-hour channel, but not just a 24-hour channel. The Turkish government graciously issued us with a 10-year broadcast license, and we're broadcasting on Turksat to over 55 million Turkish-speaking people in the area today, as the only Christian channel that's been permitted on the satellite.
You know, one of the stories you tell in there is about the martyrs in this province, not too far from Istanbul. We had heard about that because these were individuals that were part of this publishing house. I think one of the actors actually played the role of Jesus, and yet they were attacked. And I think it's a good illustration of the fact that, as you said, Turkey was the home of the churches of the book of Revelation, but Turkey now, because of some of the leadership, is more anti-Christian than we probably ever seen it, and because of that, there are many that are martyred in the midst of all of the persecutions taking place.
Yeah, I mean, the new government is pro-Islamic, but it's not anti-Christian necessarily. Yes, it has, appropriated a few Christian traditional sites and turned them back into mosques and so on, but
yes.
At the same time, I think it's the nationalism that is killing the Christian witness. It's the nationalists who attacked the people in the publishing house and brutally murdered 3 of them in that terrible way. So we have to be careful to separate, the politics from the religious side of it. Actually, Turkey's having its own struggle with religion. Many people in the country have become deists. They are also disillusioned with the hypocrisy in Islam. They don't want this thrust down their throat or torture them in a forceful way without any choices. And so there is a real resistance to the Erdogan approach to bringing back Turkey to being a more Islamic society. In fact, one of the studies that was done by a Turkish professor recently showed that all those countries in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, where you've got the sort of theocracy in presence or developing, and religion plays a major part in public life, that's where you see the biggest turning away by especially young people from Islam. And it's a very interesting social phenomenon.
We're going to talk about that. Let's take a break, and then when we come back, you, of course, have some chapters on the Arab Spring and the Arab Winter and what is happening today and how we can certainly be praying for you and praying for the outreach that takes place through SAT7. And if you would like to know a little bit more, we have that link on our website, which is pointofview.net. If you go there, you can find a number of resources, including this book, if you'd like to get information about that, more information about the channels, the viewers, and some of the other resources and some of the latest news. So it's all available at SAT7, that's the number 7.org, or of course you can just simply go to the website pointofview.net, and we have that information there as well. We'll continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Terry Ascott. The book is entitled Dare to Believe, and we'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, Terry Ascott with us today as we talk about his book, Dare to Believe. You know, some of your final chapters deal with, first of all, the Arab Spring, and you have the street protest in Egypt, and, of course, all the conflict in the Middle East. Meanwhile, you're dealing with a banking crisis in Cyprus. Of course, we've been paying attention to what has happened to the believers in Iraq and all sorts sorts of other issues have all sort of unfolded. And in the midst of that, first of all, just give us a sense of where you see the Middle East going, but also how, in some respects, by supporting your television programs there, you can provide hope and encouragement in the midst of some really difficult circumstances that we find in the Middle East right now.
Yeah, the Middle East is really a hard thing to get your head around. There's so many different countries with different problems and challenges. But if you look across the map at the moment, we've got unfinished conflicts in Yemen, in Iraq still, in Syria for sure, even Libya, and we've also got a humanitarian disaster in in Yemen at the moment. Terrible famine. There's all kinds of problems with cholera and so on. And then you've got Lebanon, which used to be the kind of Paris of the Middle East, in a terrible economic and political crisis at the moment. Again, millions of people, most of them refugees, on the edge of starvation in that country. So there's a humanitarian problem. There are reforms that are needed, women's rights. Millions of kids have missed out on schooling for 4, 5, 6, 7 years, 8, 9 years in some cases. And so what we're trying to do through our broadcast, apart from making the gospel available to everyone in the Middle East, we're also addressing some of these humanitarian issues. We're providing, for example, a portal that gives school programs for the first few grades in different subjects, math and Arabic, English, and science and so on. And we're also broadcasting these at certain hours as well on the Kids channel. And we're also seeking to kind of sow the seeds of inclusiveness. I mean, the problem with democracy is, you can have the institutions of democracy, a free and fair press, independent judiciary, voting, and so on. But if you don't have a fundamental respect for people who have a different opinion and are willing to make room for them in society, especially Christian minorities here, I'm thinking, but also for the disabled, for women, for children with disabilities, and so on, the refugees, you're never going to have a stable, peaceful, democratic society.
Very true.
And so we're trying to address all of these different issues through a holistic approach to Christian programming.
And again, you cannot build basically a republic or a democracy on that kind of soil and those kind of attitudes. So that, I think, is, again, so crucial to a biblical view and certainly the gospel. But just before I let you go, I did point people a couple of times to sat7.org. And I think, if nothing else, Terry, there are a number of people that might say, well, I'd like to help. How can I help? What can we do to support you and to support this outreach to North Africa and the Middle East?
Well, obviously, prayer is huge. And we've seen miracles, real miracles, over the last 25 years of this ministry. And I put that down to the prayers of those that support us. Financial support, of course, is important. We don't sell our airtime. We don't sell advertising time. All our channels are made freely available, free to air to our different viewers on the different languages and channels. So financial support is always a challenge, although God has really blessed us over the years and enabled us to expand to 4 full-time 24-hour channels in these 3 languages. So, we'd also my book will give you a bit of a handle on the Middle East. It will also explain some of these differences and the hope that there is for Christian witness in the region. It will inspire people, I think, to read these stories of courageous Christian brothers and sisters in the Middle East. And we need people who are willing to learn about the region so they can pray more intelligently and more passionately. It's very hard. I mean, before I went to the Middle East, I didn't know what what a Lebanese looked like, or I didn't really have any vision for them. It's only really going there and meeting them, or reading a book, or seeing a film, perhaps. But it's very hard, just to get a vision out of nowhere. So please, we want people to engage more with the in-depth dimensions of the Middle East, so they too can become really passionate in their support and their prayers for the region.
Let me just mention we've done a couple of things on our website. First of all, we've got your bio, and then we, of course, have a link to sat7.org. But if you scroll down a little bit further, you'll see, first of all, we have kind of the bio for Dr. Terrence Ascott, and we also have, interestingly enough, a little video, which is a little less than 10 minutes, where you're interviewed on that subject. So that will be helpful for some of those individuals. And if you scroll down a little bit further, further information about the book. So we've got a lot of resources that are available to everyone, and I hope that you will take the time to go to our website, pointofview.net, and find out more about this book, Dare to Believe, and of course about this incredible outreach called Sat7 to the Middle East. So, Terry, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thank you very much for having me.
Well, again, just before we wind down for the program today, I wanted to mention some of the articles that we have posted and give you some links that you can find there as well. I did mention just a minute ago that also the Viewpoints commentary is on The Last Call for Liberty, and that is a book by Os Guinness. If you were not familiar with that, that is an opportunity for you to see that Viewpoints commentary, and it is available to you. And for those of you that maybe have been listening to the program for some time, it is amazing to me how many times over the last couple of weeks I've run into people, either station managers or individual listeners, that did not know that they could actually receive this commentary each day. Now, for those of you that are listeners, you can actually go to the website, pointofview.net, click on that particular commentary. You'll see a section that says, Never Miss a Viewpoint. Sign up here. For those of you that are station managers or of those in the network, I've been amazed how many do not know that my 2-minute commentary is available to you. And so you can pull it down and use that to educate your listeners. And again, we take some of the material we talk about on this program and provide some facts and figures and information. So it's a very good 2-minute format, and I hope you'll think about using that as well. As we wind down for today, this particular day, August 3rd, very important to me. 47 years ago, I married my wife, and so this is our anniversary. So I just thought I would say to my wife, a happy anniversary, and what a long and incredible journey it has been over 47 years. And so if nothing else, did want to take just a moment to say to ourselves, happy anniversary. But most importantly, I'm sure some of you are having birthdays and anniversaries, and we salute you as well. That's all we have for today here on Point of View. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to hear that again, or I'd like to pass this on to our mission pastor, simply go to our website that says listen or watch. You can either listen to it, download it as a podcast, or you can, of course, go to the YouTube channel and find that information as well. Lots of topics we've addressed. We will address a whole lot more tomorrow, and I hope that you will take the time to join us here. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes, and we'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.